I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm 45 years old. And until that moment sitting across from HR Director Janet Rodriguez in Conference Room C, I genuinely believed that maybe I really was as incompetent as they said I was. Kevin Thompson, my manager, had just finished explaining to Janet why my consistent failure to meet basic performance standards made me a liability to the engineering team. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He glanced at me with that familiar look of disappointment and said, Sarah just doesn't have what it takes to keep up with modern development practices. Like I was some relic from the Stone Age of coding. Like my 15 years of software engineering experience meant absolutely nothing. Like the countless nights I'd spent in that sterile office building, debugging code and optimizing systems while everyone else went home to their families, had been a complete waste of time. I sat there in that uncomfortable gray chair, staring at the termination paperwork spread across the glass table, feeling smaller with every word Kevin spoke. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this conversation in the conference room nicknamed the Glass Box by employees. Transparent walls, transparent lies, I thought bitterly. Through those walls, I could see my former colleagues at their desks, some stealing glances our way, others pretending to be absorbed in their screens. Brad Wilson, the lead developer who'd taken over most of my recent projects, was leaning back in his chair with what looked suspiciously like a smirk. Janet slid the papers closer to me and spoke in that rehearsed professional tone that HR directors perfect over years of delivering bad news. Sarah, this decision wasn't made lightly. We've documented multiple instances where your work failed to meet company standards. The recent Cloud Sync optimization project was particularly concerning. My heart sank deeper with each word. The Cloud Sync project. The one where I'd spent 8 months developing what I knew was revolutionary technology, only to watch it get reassigned to Brad's team in the final weeks. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but honestly, most of it was a blur of corporate speak and legal formalities. Kevin outlined my supposed failures with the precision of someone who'd been building a case for months. Failed to integrate properly with the team dynamic. Inability to adapt to new methodologies. Resistance to collaborative problem-solving approaches. Each accusation felt like a punch to the gut, especially because I knew they were twisting the truth. What Kevin called resistance to collaboration was actually my refusal to hand over my code documentation to Brad without proper credit attribution. What he termed inability to adapt was my insistence on thorough testing protocols instead of rushing features to production. And failure to integrate with team dynamics apparently meant I'd questioned why my algorithm optimization suggestions were consistently ignored during team meetings, only to see similar implementations appear weeks later under Brad's name. I signed the papers because what choice did I have? No severance package, just 2 weeks of pay and a standard non-disclosure agreement that Kevin seemed particularly eager for me to acknowledge. As I walked back to my desk to pack up my belongings, the office felt different. The familiar hum of keyboards and quiet conversations seemed muted, like I was already a ghost haunting a place I no longer belonged. My desk was a small island in the open plan engineering section, desk 47B, positioned perfectly to overlook the city skyline when I needed a moment to think through complex problems. Now it just felt exposed and vulnerable. I started packing my personal items into a cardboard box Janet had provided. A small succulent plant my sister had given me, a coffee mug with a faded JavaScript joke, a framed photo of my daughter's college graduation, and a small notebook where I'd sketched out algorithm concepts during lunch breaks. As I cleaned out my drawers, my fingers brushed against something I'd almost forgotten about. Tucked beneath some old project notes was a printed copy of an email confirmation from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, dated 18 months earlier. The subject line read, "Application received, Dynamic Multi-Layer Data Optimization System." My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the document. In all the chaos of the recent months, the stress of deteriorating work relationships, and the constant pressure to prove myself, I'd completely lost track of my patent application status. The algorithm described in that patent was the same core technology I'd developed for the Cloud Sync optimization project. The same innovation that Kevin claimed had failed to meet standards. The same code architecture that Brad's team was now apparently perfecting under their own guidance. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, a small seed of something that felt dangerously close to hope, beginning to sprout in my chest. Tom Baker, a fellow engineer who'd been with Techflow for about 3 years, approached my desk as I finished packing. Tom had always been one of the few colleagues who actually listened during technical discussions, who asked thoughtful questions about implementation strategies, rather than immediately dismissing ideas that challenged the status quo. He glanced around nervously before leaning closer to my desk. "Sarah, this is complete garbage and everyone knows it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That optimization work you did was brilliant. I've seen the performance metrics. Your algorithm reduced processing time by 60% compared to our previous system." He paused, checking again to make sure no one was listening. "Brad's been reverse engineering your approach for weeks. I've watched him studying your code commits, taking screenshots of your documentation. This whole incompetence narrative is manufactured bullshit." I looked up at Tom, surprised by his directness. In 3 years of working together, he'd always been professional but reserved, the kind of person who kept his head down and focused on his own projects. Seeing him take this risk to speak up meant more than he probably realized. "Tom, I appreciate you saying that, but it doesn't matter now. They've made their decision." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the exhaustion creeping in. "It does matter," he insisted, glancing toward Kevin's office where our former manager was visible through glass walls, talking animatedly on the phone. "Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but there's been talk. Brad's been meeting with Lisa Chen about presenting some kind of breakthrough innovation to the new CEO when he starts next month. Something about revolutionary data compression technology that could save enterprise clients millions in storage costs." The words hit me like a physical blow. Revolutionary data compression technology, that was exactly what my algorithm accomplished. The same algorithm that was supposedly substandard work warranting my termination. The same innovation that was now apparently worthy of executive presentation under Brad's name. I felt a familiar anger building in my chest. The same frustrated rage I'd been suppressing during months of watching my contributions get minimized and dismissed. I finished packing in silence, Tom hovering nearby with an expression that suggested he wanted to say more but wasn't sure how. As I stood to leave, carrying my cardboard box and laptop bag, he touched my arm gently. "Sarah, I know this sounds crazy, but keep track of what happens with that cloud sync project. Document everything you can remember about your original work. I have a feeling you're going to need it." Walking out of Techflow Tower that afternoon felt surreal. The elevator ride down 15 floors gave me time to stare at my reflection in the polished steel doors. I looked tired, defeated, older than my 45 years. The woman staring back at me seemed like a stranger, someone who'd lost more than just a job. I'd lost confidence in my own abilities, trust in my judgment, and faith in the idea that good work speaks for itself. The Austin heat hit me as I stepped outside, the kind of oppressive humidity that makes you question why anyone chooses to live in Texas. I sat in my car in the parking garage for nearly an hour, not ready to go home and explain to my daughter Emma what had happened. How do you tell your kid that the career you've built over 15 years just evaporated because you supposedly weren't good enough? How do you explain that sometimes hard work and talent aren't enough when you're dealing with people who see you as an obstacle to their own advancement? I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I Googled my own name along with patent application status. The USPTO website was bureaucratic and difficult to navigate, but eventually I found what I was looking for. Application number 17,842,156 for Dynamic Multi-Layer Data Optimization System, filed by Sarah Elena Martinez 18 months earlier. Status, under final review. Expected decision within 30 days. 30 days. In 30 days, I might have official recognition that the technology Kevin dismissed as substandard was actually innovative enough to warrant federal patent protection. The timing felt like cosmic irony. I'd been fired for incompetence just weeks before potentially receiving validation that my work was literally patent-worthy. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything I could remember about the CloudSync project. Every meeting, every email exchange, every technical decision, every moment when my suggestions were dismissed or my contributions were minimized. Tom's words echoed in my mind. Document everything. If Brad was really planning to present my algorithm as his own breakthrough innovation, I wanted to be ready with a detailed record of the actual development process. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. Kevin had started marginalizing my input almost immediately after I'd demonstrated the initial algorithm prototype. Meetings where I'd previously been included as a key contributor suddenly happened without my knowledge. Technical discussions that should have involved my expertise were rescheduled when I wasn't available. Code reviews of my work became increasingly nitpicky, focusing on minor style preferences rather than functional excellence. Most telling was the timeline. My patent application had been filed 8 months into the CloudSync project, when I still believed I was a valued team member working on something revolutionary. The application included detailed technical specifications, algorithm descriptions, and implementation methodologies that I'd developed independently, often during my own time using my own resources for research and testing. Over the following weeks, I fell into a routine of job searching during the day and patent research at night. The unemployment application process was humiliating, requiring me to list the reason for my termination and explain why I was no longer employed. Performance issues felt like a betrayal of everything I'd accomplished, but it was technically accurate according to Techflow's official documentation. Meanwhile, I dove deep into understanding patent law and the protection it might offer. I learned that being the named inventor on a patent application creates certain legal rights, regardless of employment status. I discovered that using someone else's patented technology without permission constitutes infringement, potentially subject to significant financial penalties. Most importantly, I found out that patent applications include detailed filing dates and inventor information that create an official record of who developed what technology and when. 3 weeks after my termination, Tom Baker sent me a text message that made my blood run cold. New CEO starts Monday. Brad's presentation is Tuesday afternoon. They're calling it Project Breakthrough and claiming it will revolutionize. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Enterprise data management. Thought you should know. Project Breakthrough. They'd even given my algorithm a fancy project name for its official unveiling. I spent that weekend in a state of anxious anticipation, knowing that my former colleague was about to present my work as his own innovation to Techflow's new leadership. Part of me wanted to call the company, to send emails, to somehow intervene before the presentation happened. But another part of me, the part that had been beaten down by months of being told I wasn't good enough, whispered that maybe I was wrong. Maybe Brad had genuinely improved on my work. Maybe I was just a bitter ex-employee looking for someone to blame for my own failures. Monday morning, I checked the USPTO website again, a habit I'd developed over the past few weeks. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the updated status for application 17,842,156. Decision: patent granted. Issue date: current. Patent number: U.S. Patent 11,847,392. I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading and rereading the official notification. After 18 months of waiting, I was now the officially recognized inventor of the dynamic multi-layered data optimization system. The same system that had supposedly been substandard work warranting my termination. The same algorithm that Brad Wilson was planning to present as breakthrough innovation the following day. The patent documentation was comprehensive, including detailed technical specifications, implementation methodologies, and performance benchmarks that I'd submitted with my original application. Every aspect of the algorithm was officially attributed to me, with filing dates that predated my involvement in the CloudSync project by several months. It was irrefutable proof that the technology was my original creation, developed independently and documented through proper legal channels. I printed out every page of the patent documentation, creating multiple copies and storing them in different locations. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and empowering. I called Amanda Foster, a patent attorney whose name I'd found during my research into intellectual property law. Her office was in downtown Austin, just a few blocks from Techflow Tower, and she specialized in cases involving workplace patent disputes. Amanda's voice was professional but warm when I explained my situation. She listened without interruption as I described the timeline: my algorithm development, the patent application, the workplace marginalization, my termination for alleged incompetence, and the planned presentation of my technology under someone else's name. When I finished, there was a long pause before she responded. Sarah, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just workplace politics or a personality conflict. This is potential patent infringement on a commercial scale. When can you come in to discuss this in detail? Her tone had shifted from polite interest to serious concern. And bring every piece of documentation you have, every email, every note, every screenshot. We're going to need to build a comprehensive record of what happened. Tuesday morning, I sat in Amanda's office overlooking downtown Austin, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd spent an hour reviewing my documentation, asking detailed questions about the technical development process, the workplace dynamics, and the timeline of events leading to my termination. Her legal pad was covered with notes, and she'd made photocopies of every document I'd brought. Sarah, you have an exceptionally strong case, she said, looking up from her notes. Your patent documentation is thorough and properly filed. The timeline clearly establishes your work as predating any team involvement. And if they proceed with this presentation today, they'll be creating evidence of willful infringement. She paused, studying my face. The question is, what do you want to accomplish? Are you looking for financial compensation, public vindication, or something else? I thought about Tom's words, about the months of being made to feel incompetent, about signing termination papers while my own innovation was being stolen. I want the truth to come out. I want recognition for my work, and I want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Amanda nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. Then we're going to give them an opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily. And if they choose not to take it, we'll make sure the truth comes out anyway. That afternoon, while Brad Wilson was presumably presenting my algorithm as breakthrough innovation to Techflow's new CEO, I was working with Amanda to draft a formal notice of patent infringement. The document was precise and professional, outlining my patent rights, the documented timeline of development, and the potential legal consequences of unauthorized use of my technology. It gave Techflow exactly 7 days to respond with a plan for proper attribution and compensation. We decided to send the notice directly to the new CEO, Michael Rivera, rather than going through Kevin Thompson or Lisa Chen. Amanda's research had revealed that Rivera had a reputation for ethical leadership and transparent business practices. He'd been brought in specifically to restore Techflow's culture after several years of declining employee satisfaction and increased turnover under the previous leadership. As I signed the legal documents that would formally assert my patent rights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just hope, but actual power. For the first time since being escorted out of Techflow Tower, I wasn't just reacting to what others had done to me. I was taking control of my own narrative, armed with legal documentation that proved my worth in the most official way possible. The next 7 days would determine whether Techflow's new leadership was genuinely committed to doing the right thing, or whether Amanda and I would be taking this fight to the next level. Either way, I was done being silent about my own achievements. I was done accepting other people's assessments of my competence. And I was definitely done letting anyone else take credit for work that was officially, legally, and undeniably mine. The week following our legal notice submission felt like living in suspended animation. Amanda had warned me that corporate responses to patent infringement claims could take time, especially when they involve new leadership trying to understand complex technical and legal situations. But knowing that didn't make the waiting any easier. Every morning I checked my email obsessively, looking for some sign that Michael Rivera had received our documentation and was taking it seriously. On Thursday morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The caller ID showed a Dallas area code, and for a moment I wondered if it might be someone from the patent office with additional questions about my application. Instead, the voice on the other end was crisp and professional, introducing herself as Rebecca Chen, executive assistant to the CEO at Techflow Solutions. Ms. Martinez, Mr. Rivera would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss some recent correspondence his office received. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock? The tone was neutral, giving me no indication whether this was good news or bad news. I agreed to the meeting, my heart pounding, as I realized that Techflow's new leadership was at least taking my claims seriously enough to warrant a face-to-face conversation. I called Amanda immediately to let her know about the meeting request. Her response was cautiously optimistic but firm about the importance of having legal representation present. Sarah, this could go several different ways. They might be genuinely interested in resolving this fairly, or they could be trying to gather information to build a defense against your claims. Either way, you shouldn't go in there alone. We arranged for her to attend the meeting with me, and she spent the rest of our phone call coaching me on what to expect and how to respond to various scenarios. That evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to decide what to wear to a meeting that could potentially change the entire trajectory of my career. The woman looking back at me seemed different than the one who had packed up her desk in defeat just a few weeks earlier. There was something harder in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. I'd spent so many years trying to fit in, trying to prove myself worthy of acceptance, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to know with absolute certainty that I was right. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Austin summers legendary. Amanda and I met in the lobby of Techflow Tower, the same building I'd walked out of carrying a cardboard box full of personal belongings. The security guard who checked us in was someone I recognized from my years of working there, but he showed no sign of remembering me. It was a small reminder of how quickly corporate memory fades when it comes to former employees. The elevator ride to the executive floor was surreal. I'd worked in this building for over 3 years, but had never been above the 15th floor where the engineering department was located. The executive level was a different world entirely, with polished marble floors, expensive artwork, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that suggests important decisions happen behind closed doors. Rebecca Chen met us at the elevator, a woman in her 30s with the efficient demeanor of someone who manages complex schedules and sensitive communications for a living. She led us down a hallway lined with portraits of company founders and milestone achievements, past conference rooms with names like Innovation and Synergy, to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Austin skyline. Michael Rivera stood as we entered, extending his hand with the kind of confident grip that suggests someone comfortable with authority, but not arrogant about it. He was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with graying temples and the alert expression of someone who'd built his career on asking the right questions. His office was spacious but not ostentatious, with a large desk, comfortable seating area, and walls lined with books rather than corporate awards. Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming in on short notice. And Ms. Foster, I appreciate you joining us. He gestured toward a conference table positioned near the windows, where someone had already laid out copies of what I recognized as our patent infringement notice, along with several other documents I couldn't immediately identify. I have to say, your letter raised some very serious concerns that I felt needed to be addressed immediately. As we settled into our chairs, I noticed that Rivera's copy of our documentation was heavily annotated with handwritten notes and yellow sticky tabs marking specific sections. This wasn't someone who had casually skimmed through legal paperwork before a meeting. He'd clearly spent significant time studying the details of my claims and the supporting evidence we'd provided. Before we begin, I want to be transparent about what I've learned since receiving your notice, Rivera continued, his tone serious but not defensive. I've spent the past 2 days conducting my own investigation into the circumstances surrounding your termination and the CloudSync project timeline. What I've discovered is, frankly, deeply troubling. He opened a folder and pulled out a document that made my stomach tighten with recognition. It was a printout of Brad Wilson's presentation slides from the previous Tuesday, the one Tom had warned me about. The title slide read, Project Breakthrough, Revolutionary Data Compression Innovation, with Brad's name prominently displayed as the lead developer and primary innovator. This presentation was delivered to our executive team on Tuesday afternoon, Rivera said, sliding the document across the table so Amanda and I could examine it more closely. The technology described in these slides appears to be virtually identical to what's outlined in your patent documentation. Same core algorithm, same optimization methodology, same performance benchmarks. I flipped through the slides, feeling a mixture of vindication and anger as I saw my work presented under Brad's name. Every technical detail, every implementation strategy, every innovation I'd developed during those long nights of coding and testing had been repackaged as someone else's breakthrough achievement. The final slide contained a timeline claiming that Brad had developed the technology over the past 6 months, completely erasing my contribution and predating my involvement by claiming independent development. Mr. Rivera, what's particularly concerning is the timeline discrepancy, Amanda interjected, pulling out her own copy of my patent documentation. As you can see from the USPTO filing dates, Ms. Martinez submitted her patent application 18 months ago, long before Mr. Wilson claims to have begun developing this technology. The detailed technical specifications in her application are virtually identical to what's presented in these slides. Rivera nodded grimly, making notes on his legal pad as Amanda spoke. I've also reviewed Ms. Martinez's employment file and the documentation supporting her termination. The performance issues cited by her manager, Kevin Thompson, seem to focus heavily on her work on the CloudSync project. Specifically, claims that her contributions were substandard and failed to meet company expectations. The irony was almost laughable. I'd been fired for creating technology that was apparently revolutionary enough to warrant executive presentation as a company breakthrough. The same algorithm that Kevin had dismissed as inadequate was now being hailed as innovation that could transform Techflow's competitive position in the enterprise software market. Ms. Martinez, I need to ask you some direct questions about the development process, Rivera continued, leaning forward slightly. Can you walk me through how you created this algorithm? What resources did you use? Did you develop it during company time or on your own initiative? I spent the next 30 minutes describing the technical development process in detail. How I had identified inefficiencies in existing data compression methods during my regular work on CloudSync. How I'd spent evenings and weekends researching advanced mathematical approaches to optimization problems. How I'd used my own laptop and personal software licenses to prototype and test different algorithmic approaches before implementing anything on company systems. Most importantly, I explained how I documented the entire development process in my personal notebooks and saved all my research files on a private cloud storage account that I maintained separately from company systems. Amanda had advised me to emphasize the independent nature of my innovation, establishing that while I'd been employed by Techflow, the creative and intellectual work had been done using my own time and resources. The patent application itself was filed using my personal information and paid for with my own funds, I added, pulling out copies of the financial records Amanda had suggested I bring. I chose to incorporate the technology into my CloudSync work because I believed it would benefit the company, but the underlying innovation was my independent creation. Rivera made extensive notes throughout my explanation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific technical details or timeline elements. His questions were intelligent and focused, suggesting someone with enough technical background to understand the complexity of what I'd developed. It was refreshing to discuss my work with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding the innovation, rather than dismissing it or claiming credit for it. Ms. Foster, from a legal perspective, what are Ms. Martinez's rights in this situation? Rivera asked, turning his attention to my attorney. And what obligations does Techflow have regarding technology that may have been developed by an employee, but independently patented? Amanda opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of legal precedents and patent law documentation. Mr. Rivera, the situation is quite clear from an intellectual property standpoint. Ms. Martinez holds a federally granted patent for this technology, which gives her exclusive rights to its use and commercialization. The fact that she was employed by Techflow during the development period doesn't automatically transfer those rights to the company, especially since she used her own resources and filed the patent independently. She spread several legal documents across the table, pointing to specific sections as she continued her explanation. More concerning is the apparent misrepresentation of the technology's origins in Mr. Wilson's presentation. Claiming to have independently developed patented technology that belongs to someone else constitutes willful infringement, which can result in significant financial penalties, including treble damages. The legal terminology seemed to have a sobering effect on Rivera, who was taking careful notes about potential liability and legal exposure. I could see him processing the implications of what Amanda was describing, not just for the individuals involved, but for the company's reputation and financial position. There's also the question of how this situation arose in the first place, Amanda continued, her tone becoming more pointed. Ms. Martinez was terminated for allegedly producing substandard work on a project that incorporated her own patented technology. Either the technology is revolutionary, as presented to your executive team, or it's substandard as claimed in her termination documentation. It cannot be both. The contradiction was stark when laid out so directly. Either I was an incompetent engineer whose work failed to meet basic standards, or I was an innovator whose technology was worthy of federal patent protection and executive presentation as breakthrough achievement. The timeline and documentation made it impossible for both narratives to be true. Rivera leaned back in his chair, studying the documents spread across the table with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Ms. Martinez, I need to ask about your interactions with Kevin Thompson and Brad Wilson during the CloudSync project. Did you have any indication that they were planning to present your work as independent innovation? I thought carefully about how to answer, remembering Amanda's advice about sticking to factual observations rather than speculating about others' motivations. Mr. Rivera, I noticed that my contributions to the project were increasingly marginalized over the final months. Technical discussions that should have included my input happened without my knowledge. Code reviews became focused on minor style issues rather than functional improvements. And when I raised concerns about proper attribution for my algorithm development, those concerns were dismissed as unimportant. More specifically, I continued, pulling out my notebook where I'd documented the timeline of events, there was a meeting in March where I presented performance benchmarks showing 60% improvement in processing efficiency using my algorithm. Kevin's response was that the improvements were negligible and that I should focus on more practical optimizations. But according to Mr. Wilson's presentation slides, that same 60% improvement is now being highlighted as a revolutionary breakthrough. Rivera made a note about the specific meeting, then asked Rebecca to pull the official meeting minutes from March to verify the details. It was becoming clear that he was treating this as a serious investigation rather than a routine legal complaint, which gave me hope that Techflow's new leadership might actually be committed to addressing the situation fairly. Ms. Foster, what would constitute an appropriate resolution from your perspective? Rivera asked, turning back to my attorney. Assuming that Ms. Martinez's claims are verified through our internal investigation, what are you seeking in terms of remediation? Amanda had prepared me for this question, and we'd discussed various possible outcomes during our previous meetings. Mr. Rivera, our primary objectives are recognition, attribution, and fair compensation. Ms. Martinez should be acknowledged as the inventor of this technology. Any commercial use of her patented algorithm should include proper licensing agreements with appropriate royalty payments. And there should be some form of remediation for the professional damage caused by her wrongful termination. She paused, looking directly at Rivera before continuing. We're also concerned about the broader pattern of behavior that allowed this situation to develop. If Techflow's management was willing to terminate an employee for creating technology they later planned to present as company innovation, that suggests systemic problems that go beyond this individual case. The meeting continued for another hour, with Rivera asking detailed questions about the technical development process, the workplace dynamics I'd experienced, and the documentation supporting my claims. He also spent considerable time discussing the legal implications with Amanda, particularly the potential financial exposure Techflow might face if they continued using my patented technology without proper licensing. As our discussion wound down, Rivera made a commitment that surprised me with its directness. Ms. Martinez, I want to be clear about my position on this matter. If our investigation confirms what you've presented today, then Techflow owes you a significant apology and meaningful remediation. No employee should be terminated for creating innovative technology, and no company should benefit from misrepresenting the origins of patented intellectual property. He stood, indicating that the meeting was concluding, but his expression remained serious and engaged. I'm going to need approximately 1 week to conduct a thorough internal investigation. This will include reviewing all documentation related to your termination, interviewing the individuals involved in the CloudSync project, and consulting with our legal team about appropriate next steps. Rebecca will contact you early next week to schedule a follow-up meeting where we can discuss our findings and potential resolution. As Amanda and I gathered our documents and prepared to leave, Rivera made one final comment that stayed with me long after we'd left his office. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that the technology you developed is genuinely impressive. The performance improvements outlined in your patent documentation represent exactly the kind of innovation that should be celebrated and rewarded, not suppressed or misattributed. Regardless of how this situation developed, you should be proud of what you've accomplished. Walking out of Techflow Tower that afternoon felt completely different than it had a few weeks earlier. Instead of carrying a cardboard box full of personal belongings, I was carrying legal documentation that proved my worth and established my rights. Instead of feeling defeated and questioning my own competence, I felt vindicated and empowered. The conversation with Rivera had been more productive and encouraging than I dared to hope. Amanda and I debriefed over coffee at a nearby cafe, reviewing how the meeting had gone and discussing potential next steps. She was cautiously optimistic about Rivera's response, particularly his commitment to conducting a thorough investigation and his acknowledgement of the technology's value. However, she also warned me that corporate investigations could be unpredictable, and we needed to be prepared for various possible outcomes. Sarah, the fact that he took the meeting seriously and asked intelligent questions is encouraging, she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. But we also need to be realistic about the pressures he's facing. He's new to the company, dealing with a situation that could expose significant legal liability, and trying to navigate relationships with existing management who may have been involved in the problematic decisions. Over the weekend, I found myself oscillating between hope and anxiety about what Techflow's investigation might reveal. Part of me was confident that the evidence was clear and that any honest review would vindicate my claims. But another part of me worried about corporate loyalty, office politics, and the possibility that Rivera might decide it was easier to dismiss my concerns than to address the systemic problems they represented. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Tom Baker, my former colleague who had originally warned me about Brad's presentation plans. His voice was excited but cautious as he explained why he was calling. Sarah, something interesting happened this morning. Michael Rivera called an all-hands meeting for the engineering department, and he asked very specific questions about the CloudSync project development timeline. He wanted to know who had contributed what work, when different components were developed, and how decisions were made about project leadership and credit attribution. Tom paused, and I could hear the sound of office activity in the background. But here's the really interesting part. After the meeting, Rivera asked to speak privately with several of us who had worked closely on CloudSync. He has copies of all the code commits, the email communications, and the project documentation. It's like he's building a comprehensive timeline of exactly what happened and who did what work. The news was encouraging, but also nerve-wracking. A thorough investigation was exactly what I'd hoped for, but it also meant that my former colleagues were being asked to take positions about events that could have significant consequences for their own careers. I appreciated Tom's willingness to be honest about my contributions, but I also understood that not everyone would be comfortable speaking up about management decisions or colleague behavior. Tom, I want you to know that I appreciate you being willing to tell the truth about what happened, I said carefully. But I also don't want you to feel like you have to put your own job at risk to support my claims. The evidence should speak for itself. Sarah, you don't understand, Tom replied, his voice becoming more animated. This isn't about taking risks or picking sides. The documentation is so clear that anyone who reviews it honestly can see exactly what happened. Your code commits are time-stamped. Your algorithm development is documented in detail. And Brad's later implementations are obviously derivative of your original work. He went on to explain that Rivera had also requested copies of all email communications related to the CloudSync project, including messages between Kevin Thompson and Brad Wilson about project management and resource allocation. Apparently, the digital paper trail was more comprehensive than anyone had realized, creating an objective record of how decisions were made and how credit was distributed. Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca Chen called to schedule the follow-up meeting Rivera had promised. Her tone was professional but warmer than it had been during our first conversation, which I chose to interpret as a positive sign. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, giving me 2 more days to prepare for what felt like a pivotal moment in this entire process. Amanda and I spent Wednesday afternoon reviewing our documentation and discussing various scenarios for how Thursday's meeting might unfold. She'd researched similar cases involving patent disputes and wrongful termination, giving her insights into how companies typically respond when faced with clear evidence of intellectual property misappropriation. The encouraging sign is that Rivera seems to be conducting a genuine investigation rather than just going through the motions, she said, organizing our files for easy reference during the meeting. Companies that are planning to deny responsibility or minimize their exposure usually don't invest this much time and effort in reviewing the evidence. Thursday morning arrived with a thunderstorm that seemed appropriate for the dramatic potential of the day ahead. Amanda and I met again in the Techflow Tower lobby, both of us carrying expanded documentation that we'd prepared based on questions that had arisen during our previous meeting. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt different this time, less like entering enemy territory, and more like approaching a resolution that might actually be fair. Michael Rivera's office looked essentially the same as it had the previous week, but the atmosphere felt distinctly different. Instead of the formal conference table arrangement, he'd set up a more casual seating area with comfortable chairs arranged around a coffee table. Rebecca had prepared coffee and pastries, creating an environment that suggested collaboration rather than confrontation. More significantly, Rivera was not alone. Seated across from him was a woman I didn't recognize, someone in her 50s with the authoritative presence of senior management. Rivera introduced her as Patricia Williams, Techflow's chief legal counsel, who had been brought in to ensure that any resolution was handled properly from a legal and corporate governance perspective. Ms. Martinez, Ms. Foster, thank you for coming in again, Rivera began, his expression serious but not grim. I wanted to update you on what our investigation has revealed and discuss how we'd like to move forward. He opened a thick folder and pulled out what appeared to be a comprehensive report with multiple sections and appendices. First, I want to acknowledge that your claims have been substantiated by our internal review. The evidence clearly shows that you developed the core algorithm technology independently, that you properly filed for patent protection, and that your contributions to the CloudSync project were both significant and inadequately recognized. His tone was formal but apologetic, the kind of careful language that suggested legal review but genuine regret. Patricia Williams leaned forward, adding her own perspective to Rivera's summary. Ms. Martinez, our investigation has also revealed concerning patterns in how your work was managed and evaluated. The performance issues cited in your termination appear to have been fabricated or exaggerated to justify a predetermined decision to remove you from the project. The words hit me with a combination of vindication and anger. Fabricated performance issues. A predetermined decision to remove me. These were the suspicions I'd harbored but been afraid to voice. The paranoid thoughts I dismissed as symptoms of workplace stress and personal insecurity. Having them confirmed by Techflow's own investigation was both validating and infuriating. Rivera continued with details that painted an increasingly damning picture of how my termination had been orchestrated. Kevin Thompson had apparently been documenting minor issues and style preferences as major performance problems, building a case for my removal that began almost immediately after I demonstrated the algorithm's effectiveness. Email communications between Kevin and Brad Wilson revealed discussions about, quote, managing the transition and ensuring project continuity that clearly referred to marginalizing my involvement and transferring credit for my work. Most damaging was a series of messages between Kevin and Lisa Chen, the VP of Engineering, discussing the intellectual property complications of my patent application and the need to distance the company from potential legal exposure. The timeline showed that they'd been aware of my patent filing for months before my termination and had specifically structured my performance evaluation to justify removing me before the patent was granted. The pattern of behavior we've uncovered represents a serious violation of Techflow's ethical standards and legal obligations, Patricia Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to handling complex corporate liability issues. We cannot and will not tolerate employees being terminated to facilitate the misappropriation of their intellectual property. As the meeting continued, Rivera and Williams outlined a comprehensive resolution package that exceeded anything Amanda and I had discussed as realistic possibilities. Techflow was prepared to acknowledge my status as the inventor of the data compression technology, provide substantial financial compensation for my wrongful termination, and offer me a senior engineering position with guarantees about intellectual property attribution and professional autonomy. More significantly, they were prepared to take immediate action regarding the individuals who had orchestrated my termination and the attempted theft of my technology. Kevin Thompson would be terminated for cause, with his actions documented in his permanent employment record. Brad Wilson would be demoted and required to make public acknowledgement of my role in developing the CloudSync optimization technology. Lisa Chen would face formal disciplinary action and mandatory ethics training. The resolution package also included licensing terms for my patented technology that were generous enough to provide ongoing royalty income while allowing Techflow to continue benefiting from innovation I'd created during my employment. It was exactly the kind of win-win arrangement that demonstrated respect for intellectual property rights while maintaining productive business relationships. As Amanda and I reviewed the proposed settlement documents, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not just vindication or relief, but genuine excitement about the future. The resolution would restore my professional reputation, provide financial security, and create opportunities to continue developing innovative technology in an environment that valued and protected intellectual property. But perhaps most importantly, it established a precedent that could protect other employees from experiencing the kind of marginalization and exploitation I'd endured. Techflow's willingness to investigate honestly, acknowledge wrongdoing, and implement systemic changes suggested that my experience might actually contribute to creating a more ethical and supportive workplace culture. The meeting concluded with handshakes, signed agreements, and a timeline for implementing the various components of our resolution. As Amanda and I gathered our documents and prepared to leave, Rivera made one final comment that crystallized why this outcome felt so significant. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that your willingness to pursue this matter has helped us identify and address problems that went far beyond your individual situation. The investigation revealed patterns of behavior that were inconsistent with the kind of company we're trying to build. Your courage in speaking up has made Techflow a better place for everyone. Walking out of Techflow Tower that afternoon, I felt like a completely different person than the one who had packed up her desk in defeat just a few weeks earlier. Instead of carrying a cardboard box full of personal belongings, I was carrying a settlement agreement that acknowledged my worth and established my rights. Instead of feeling defeated and questioning my own competence, I felt vindicated and empowered to continue pursuing the innovative work that had always been my passion. The thunderstorm had passed while we were in the meeting, leaving the Austin air clean and fresh with the promise of new possibilities. As Amanda and I celebrated our successful resolution over lunch at a downtown restaurant, I realized that this experience had taught me something invaluable about standing up for myself and refusing to accept other people's assessments of my worth. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones where you're fighting not just for immediate justice, but for the principle that talent and innovation deserve recognition and respect, regardless of office politics or personal relationships. And sometimes, the best outcome isn't just personal vindication, but the knowledge that your struggle has made things better for the people who come after you. 6 months after signing the settlement agreement with Techflow, I found myself standing in front of a different kind of audience than I'd ever imagined. The Austin Convention Center was packed with software engineers, technology executives, and startup founders who had come to hear about innovative approaches to data optimization. The banner behind me read, Tech Innovate 2024, Breakthrough Technologies Shaping Tomorrow, and my name was listed as the keynote speaker discussing From Patent to Product, Protecting Your Intellectual Property Journey. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now being celebrated for the same work that had gotten me fired just months earlier. But this wasn't about vindication anymore, it was about something much larger. The settlement with Techflow had given me more than just financial compensation and professional recognition. It had given me a platform and a purpose that I never could have anticipated when I was sitting in that termination meeting feeling utterly defeated. After returning to Techflow as senior principal engineer with intellectual property protections written directly into my employment contract, I'd discovered something remarkable. My experience wasn't unique. The more I talked to colleagues across the tech industry, the more stories I heard about innovations being suppressed, credit being redistributed, and talented engineers being marginalized when their work became valuable enough to threaten existing power structures. The difference was that most people didn't have the documentation, legal resources, or sheer stubborn determination to fight back effectively. They accepted the narrative that their work wasn't valuable, that their contributions were minimal, that they should be grateful for steady employment rather than recognition for innovation. They internalized the same lies I'd believed about my own competence and worth. During my first month back at Techflow, I'd been approached by a junior developer named Maria Santos, who was working on machine learning algorithms for predictive analytics. She'd developed a breakthrough approach to neural network optimization that could reduce training time by 40%. But her manager was pressuring her to hand over all documentation to a senior colleague who would refine it for production use. Maria's situation felt like looking into a mirror that reflected my own experience 6 months earlier. The same pattern of marginalization, the same dismissal of technical contributions, the same setup for having credit redistributed to someone with more seniority and political savvy. The difference was that now I knew how to recognize these patterns and had the resources to help someone fight back before they became a victim. I'd spent an afternoon walking Maria through the patent application process, helping her document her innovation properly, and connecting her with Amanda Foster for legal guidance. 3 weeks later, Maria had filed her own patent application and informed her manager that the technology was protected intellectual property. The sudden shift in how her contributions were valued and respected was dramatic and immediate. Word of my willingness to help colleagues protect their intellectual property spread quickly through Techflow's engineering department. Over the following months, I found myself serving as an informal mentor to developers who were creating innovative solutions but weren't sure how to protect or advocate for their work. It became clear that there was a significant gap between the brilliant technical work happening in companies like Techflow and the knowledge engineers needed to ensure they received proper credit and compensation. Michael Rivera had been incredibly supportive of my growing role as an intellectual property advocate within the company. During one of our quarterly check-ins, he'd made a comment that crystallized what was happening. "Sarah, what you're doing isn't just helping individual engineers. You're changing our entire culture around innovation and recognition. People are more willing to take creative risks when they know their work will be valued and protected." The cultural shift at Techflow was becoming visible in measurable ways. Patent applications from engineering staff had increased by 300% since my return. More importantly, the quality of innovation was improving, as engineers felt empowered to pursue ambitious projects without fear of having their work appropriated or dismissed. The company's competitive position in enterprise software was strengthening as a direct result of having a workforce that felt secure about intellectual property protection. But the impact was extending beyond Techflow's walls. Amanda Foster had introduced me to other patent attorneys who were seeing similar patterns of intellectual property exploitation across the tech industry. We'd started meeting informally to discuss cases and share strategies for helping engineers protect their innovations. These conversations led to the realization that we were dealing with a systemic problem that required a more organized response. The idea for the Innovators' Rights Initiative emerged from one of these informal gatherings. Amanda had represented 3 different cases in the past year involving engineers who'd been terminated or marginalized after developing valuable intellectual property. Another attorney, David Kim, had seen similar patterns in his practice representing startup founders whose technical partners had attempted to freeze them out of their own companies. We recognized that individual legal victories, while important, weren't addressing the underlying cultural and structural issues that allowed intellectual property exploitation to flourish. What was needed was education, advocacy, and systematic change in how companies approached innovation and employee rights. The initiative would provide resources, legal guidance, and community support for technical professionals who were creating valuable intellectual property. The first major project of the Innovators' Rights Initiative was developing a comprehensive guide to intellectual property protection for engineers and developers. Working with a team of volunteer attorneys and experienced technical professionals, we created documentation that explained patent processes, employment law, and practical strategies for protecting innovative work. The guide was released as an open-source resource that could be freely distributed and adapted for different industries and situations. The response to the guide exceeded our most optimistic expectations. Within 3 months of its release, it had been downloaded over 50,000 times and translated into 12 languages. Engineering departments at major tech companies were incorporating sections of the guide into their employee training programs. Law schools were using it as a case study in courses about intellectual property and employment law. More significantly, individual engineers were using the guide to successfully protect their own innovations. We started receiving emails from developers who had filed patent applications, negotiated better intellectual property clauses in their employment contracts, and avoided situations where their work might have been inappropriately attributed to others. Each success story reinforced our belief that education and empowerment were key to addressing systematic exploitation. The keynote speech at Tech Innovate 2024 was an opportunity to reach an even broader audience with these ideas. Standing at the podium looking out at hundreds of technical professionals, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with this platform. These were people who were creating the technologies that would shape the next decade of innovation. They deserve to understand their rights and feel empowered to protect their intellectual contributions. I began my speech by telling my own story, but not as a tale of personal vindication. Instead, I framed it as an illustration of patterns that were affecting countless engineers across the industry. The audience was engaged from the first moment, many nodding in recognition as I described the gradual marginalization of contributions, the redistribution of credit, and the pressure to accept narratives that diminish their own achievements. How many of you have developed something innovative at work, only to watch someone else receive recognition for your ideas? I asked the audience. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with easily 2/3 of the hands in the room going up. How many have been told that your technical contributions weren't significant enough to warrant formal recognition? Again, a sea of raised hands. The statistics were sobering but not surprising. Our research through the Innovators' Rights Initiative had revealed that intellectual property exploitation was remarkably common in the tech industry, particularly affecting women, people of color, and younger developers who lacked the political capital to advocate effectively for themselves. The problem was systemic and widespread, but it was also solvable through education, advocacy, and cultural change. I spent the next 40 minutes walking through practical strategies for protecting intellectual property, recognizing exploitation patterns, and building support networks within companies and professional communities. The audience was taking notes furiously, asking thoughtful questions, and sharing their own experiences during the interactive portions of the presentation. One question from a young developer in the audience particularly resonated with me. What do you do when you know your work is being stolen but you're afraid that speaking up will cost you your job? The question captured the fundamental power imbalance that made intellectual property exploitation possible. People were forced to choose between protecting their innovations and maintaining their employment security. My answer drew from everything I'd learned through my own experience and the work of the Innovators' Rights Initiative. The first step is documentation. You can't protect what you can't prove you created. The second step is education about your rights and options. The third step is building alliances with colleagues and advocates who can support you. And the fourth step is recognizing that staying silent often costs more in the long run than speaking up strategically. The response to the keynote was overwhelming. During the networking sessions that followed, I was approached by dozens of engineers who wanted to share their own stories, ask for specific advice, or learn more about the resources available through the Innovators' Rights Initiative. Several startup founders expressed interest in incorporating intellectual property protection into their company cultures from the beginning, rather than trying to address problems after they developed. Most encouraging were the conversations with managers and executives who recognized that protecting employee intellectual property wasn't just ethically important, but strategically valuable for their companies. Organizations that created cultures of innovation and recognition were attracting better talent, generating more valuable intellectual property, and building stronger competitive positions than companies that relied on exploitation and suppression. 3 days after the conference, I received a call that would change the trajectory of the Innovators' Rights Initiative in ways I never could have anticipated. The caller introduced herself as Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Director of Technology Transfer at the University of Texas at Austin. She'd been in the audience for my keynote speech and had a proposal that took my breath away. Ms. Martinez, the university is interested in establishing a formal partnership with your initiative to create an intellectual property advocacy center, she explained. We have funding available through grants focused on supporting underrepresented innovators, and we believe your work aligns perfectly with our mission to democratize access to intellectual property protection. The proposed partnership would provide the Innovators' Rights Initiative with university affiliation, research resources, and sustainable funding to expand our educational and advocacy programs. More importantly, it would give us access to law students who could provide supervised legal assistance to engineers who couldn't afford traditional patent attorney fees. The conversation with Dr. Walsh led to a series of meetings with university administrators, legal scholars, and community advocates who are working on related issues. It became clear that the problems we were addressing through the initiative were part of a broader pattern of systemic inequality in how innovation was recognized, protected, and rewarded. Over the following weeks, we developed a comprehensive proposal for the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center that would serve multiple functions. Educational programs would help technical professionals understand their rights and options. Legal clinics would provide low-cost assistance with patent applications and employment disputes. Research projects would document patterns of intellectual property exploitation and develop policy recommendations for addressing systematic problems. The center would also serve as a resource for companies that wanted to improve their intellectual property practices. Many organizations were genuinely interested in creating more equitable and supportive environments for innovation, but lacked the expertise to implement effective policies and procedures. The center could provide consulting, training, and certification programs that would help companies build cultures that truly valued and protected employee contributions. Amanda Foster had been instrumental in developing the legal framework for the university partnership, and her excitement about the potential impact was infectious. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of systematic approach that's needed to address these problems, she said during one of our planning meetings. Individual legal victories are important, but changing the underlying culture and structures requires education, research, and institutional support. The partnership agreement was finalized in early December, with a planned launch date for the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center in the following spring. The university was providing office space, administrative support, and initial funding that would allow us to hire staff and begin developing comprehensive programs. Grant applications were pending with several technology-focused foundations that could provide additional resources for expansion. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had begun with my termination from Techflow and evolved into something I never could have imagined. What had started as a personal fight for recognition had become a movement to protect the intellectual property rights of technical professionals across the industry. The work was challenging and the problems were complex, but the impact was becoming undeniable. Engineers were filing patent applications, negotiating better employment terms, and speaking up when their contributions were being marginalized. Companies were implementing policies that recognized and protected employee innovations. Legal professionals were developing expertise in intellectual property advocacy and employment law. Most importantly, a community was forming around these issues. The monthly meetups of the Austin chapter of the Innovators' Rights Initiative were drawing 50 to 60 people, including engineers, attorneys, entrepreneurs, and students. Similar chapters were forming in other cities, creating a network of advocates who could share resources, strategies, and support. During the December meetup, a software developer named Alex Chen shared a story that perfectly captured why this work mattered. Alex had developed a breakthrough algorithm for real-time language translation that could revolutionize international communication technology. Instead of having the innovation appropriated by his employer, Alex had used resources from the initiative to file a patent application and negotiate a licensing agreement that provided both protection for his intellectual property and substantial ongoing royalties. 6 months ago, I would have just handed over my work and hoped for a modest bonus, Alex told the group. Having access to education about my rights and support for protecting my innovation completely changed the trajectory of my career. Now I'm launching my own startup based on technology that I know I legally own and control. Stories like Alex's were becoming increasingly common as more technical professionals learned about their rights and felt empowered to advocate for their intellectual contributions. The cultural shift was gradual but measurable, with surveys showing increased awareness of intellectual property issues and growing confidence in pursuing protection for innovative work. The partnership with the University of Texas would allow these individual success stories to scale into systematic change. The research component of the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center would document the scope and impact of intellectual property exploitation, providing evidence that could support policy changes and legal reforms. The educational programs would reach hundreds of engineering students before they entered the workforce, creating a generation of technical professionals who understood their rights from the beginning of their careers. On New Year's Eve, as I stood on the balcony of my downtown Austin apartment looking out at the city skyline, I thought about the events that had led me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been packing up my desk at Techflow, convinced that I was a failure whose contributions weren't valuable enough to warrant recognition or protection. Now I was preparing to launch a university-affiliated center dedicated to protecting the intellectual property rights of technical professionals. The algorithm that had supposedly been substandard work was generating substantial royalty income and had been implemented by multiple companies across the industry. Most importantly, the experience had revealed a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal success or recognition. The work of the Innovators' Rights Initiative was just beginning. The problems we were addressing were systematic and deeply embedded in corporate cultures and legal structures that had evolved over decades. Changing these patterns would require sustained effort, strategic thinking, and collaboration among engineers, attorneys, policymakers, and business leaders who shared a commitment to fairness and innovation. But the foundation was solid and the momentum was building. Engineers were learning to protect their intellectual property. Companies were implementing policies that recognized and rewarded innovation. Legal professionals were developing expertise in advocacy and protection strategies. Academic institutions were supporting research and education that addressed systematic inequality in intellectual property recognition. The phone call that had started this journey, when Rebecca Chen reached out to schedule a meeting with Michael Rivera, had led to outcomes that none of us could have predicted. What began as a dispute over a single patent had evolved into a movement that was changing how the tech industry approached innovation, recognition, and intellectual property protection. As the clock struck midnight and fireworks illuminated the Austin skyline, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just personal satisfaction or professional success, but the deep fulfillment that comes from knowing that your work is making a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The young engineers who would benefit from the resources and advocacy of the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center represented the future of technological innovation. They deserved to work in an industry that valued their contributions, protected their intellectual property, and rewarded their innovations fairly. The work we were doing through the initiative and the upcoming center was helping to create that future, one patent application, one educated engineer, and one protected innovation at a time. The settlement agreement with Techflow had given me back my career and my confidence, but the work that grew out of that experience had given me something even more valuable. A purpose that aligned my technical skills, my personal values, and my commitment to justice in ways that created positive change for countless other people. Standing on that balcony as 2024 became 2025, I knew that the most important chapters of this story were still being written. The Intellectual Property Advocacy Center would open its doors in just a few months, armed with resources, expertise, and community support that could transform how technical professionals understood and protected their innovations. The algorithm that had started this journey was still generating royalties, still improving data processing efficiency for companies around the world, and still serving as proof that innovation deserves recognition regardless of the political dynamics that might try to suppress it. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when technical professionals understood their rights and felt empowered to advocate for their intellectual contributions. The future belonged to engineers, developers, and innovators who could create breakthrough technologies while also protecting their right to be recognized and rewarded for their work. The Intellectual Property Advocacy Center would help ensure that talent and innovation were valued and protected, creating an industry culture that truly supported the people whose creativity and technical expertise drove technological progress. As I finally headed inside to prepare for the year ahead, I thought about all the engineers who were working late in offices and home labs across the country, developing the technologies that would shape tomorrow. They deserved better than the marginalization and exploitation that had nearly derailed my own career. They deserved an industry that recognized their worth, protected their innovations, and rewarded their contributions fairly. The work of building that industry would continue. One educated engineer, one protected patent, and one successful advocacy case at a time. The journey that had begun with a termination meeting and a forgotten patent application had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. And the best part was that it was just the beginning. 2 years after the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center officially opened its doors at the University of Texas, I found myself walking through the bustling corridors of the Austin Convention Center once again. This time, however, I wasn't there as a keynote speaker or attendee. I was there as the director of the center, overseeing our largest annual event, the National Innovators' Rights Summit, which had grown from a regional meetup into a 3-day conference attracting over 2,000 technical professionals, attorneys, policymakers, and business leaders from across the country. The transformation had been remarkable and sometimes overwhelming. What began as informal conversations about intellectual property protection had evolved into a nationally recognized organization, with chapters in 37 cities, partnerships with 12 universities, and a legal clinic that had helped over 3,000 engineers protect their innovations. The summit was our opportunity to showcase success stories, share new research, and build the community that was driving systematic change in how America's tech industry approached innovation and recognition. Standing near the registration desk, watching streams of badge-wearing professionals navigate toward different session rooms, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The termination meeting that had felt like the end of my career had actually been the beginning of something much larger and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. The first session I attended was titled, From Exploitation to Empowerment: Legal Strategies for Protecting Technical Innovation. The presenter was Maria Santos, the junior developer I'd mentored during my early days back at Techflow. She was no longer junior anything. Her machine learning optimization patent had become the foundation for a startup that was now valued at over $50 million, and she'd become one of the most visible advocates for intellectual property rights in the artificial intelligence sector. Maria's presentation was polished and confident, a far cry from the nervous young engineer who had sought my help 3 years earlier. She was explaining to a packed auditorium how proper documentation and strategic patent filing had protected her innovations from appropriation and enabled her to build a successful company based on technology she knew she legally owned and controlled. The key insight, Maria was telling the audience, is that intellectual property protection isn't just about legal documents. It's about having the confidence to advocate for your own innovations and the community support to make that advocacy effective. She clicked to a slide showing statistics about patent filings by underrepresented groups, numbers that had improved dramatically since the center began its outreach and education programs. After her presentation, Maria and I found a quiet corner of the convention center to catch up on developments since our last conversation. She was glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had not only succeeded professionally, but had also found ways to help others achieve similar success. "Sarah, I need to tell you something that I've never properly expressed," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "When you helped me understand my rights and connect with Amanda Foster, you didn't just save my career. You changed my entire relationship with my own capabilities and worth. I stopped seeing myself as someone who needed permission to exist in tech spaces and started seeing myself as an innovator whose contributions had real value." Her words resonated deeply because they captured something I'd observed repeatedly through the center's work. The technical skills and innovative thinking were already there in most of the engineers who sought our help. What was often missing was the knowledge about rights and protections, the confidence to advocate for proper recognition, and the community support that made advocacy sustainable and effective. The afternoon session I attended was focused on corporate policy changes and featured presentations from executives at major tech companies who had implemented comprehensive intellectual property protection programs for their employees. One of the most compelling presentations came from Lisa Chen, the former Techflow VP of Engineering, who had been involved in the initial suppression of my patent work. Lisa's transformation over the past 2 years had been as dramatic as any I'd witnessed. After facing disciplinary action for her role in my termination, she had become a vocal advocate for intellectual property reform within Techflow, and eventually throughout the broader tech industry. Her presentation focused on the business case for protecting employee innovations, complete with data showing how companies with strong IP protection policies attracted better talent, generated more valuable intellectual property, and built stronger competitive positions. The traditional approach of extracting maximum value from employee innovations while providing minimal recognition or compensation is not just ethically problematic, Lisa was explaining to the audience. It's strategically counterproductive. Companies that create cultures of innovation and recognition consistently outperform those that rely on exploitation and suppression. During the question and answer session, someone from the audience asked about the financial costs of implementing comprehensive IP protection programs. Lisa's response was immediate and data-driven. The initial investment in legal resources, policy development, and training programs is significant but quickly offset by improved retention, increased innovation, and reduced legal exposure. More importantly, the competitive advantages of having a workforce that feels secure about intellectual property protection are substantial and sustainable. After the session, Lisa approached me with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal regret. Our relationship had evolved considerably since the events that led to my termination, but there was still an undercurrent of acknowledgement about the harm that had been done and the work required to repair it. Sarah, I want to update you on the latest developments in Techflow's IP protection program, she said, pulling out a tablet with what appeared to be comprehensive policy documentation. We've now processed over 200 employee patent applications through our internal support system, and we've successfully negotiated licensing agreements that provide ongoing royalties for 47 different innovations. The numbers were impressive, but what struck me most was the cultural transformation they represented. Techflow had gone from a company that systematically suppressed employee innovations to one that actively supported and rewarded intellectual property development. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it had been sustained and comprehensive. The most significant impact, Lisa continued, has been on employee confidence and creativity. When people know their innovations will be protected and rewarded, they're willing to pursue more ambitious projects and share their ideas more openly. The quality and quantity of innovation has improved dramatically. As evening approached, I made my way to the summit's main auditorium for the closing ceremony. The space was packed with nearly 2,000 attendees, representing every aspect of the intellectual property advocacy ecosystem we'd helped create. Engineers, attorneys, entrepreneurs, students, executives, and policymakers filled the seats, all united by a shared commitment to protecting and promoting innovation. The ceremony began with a presentation of the annual Innovators' Rights Impact Awards, recognizing individuals and organizations that had made significant contributions to intellectual property protection and advocacy. The first award went to Amanda Foster for her legal work, supporting over 500 engineers in patent applications and employment disputes. Her acceptance speech was characteristically direct and passionate. The work we're doing here isn't just about individual cases or personal victories, Amanda told the audience. We're changing the fundamental relationship between technical professionals and the organizations that benefit from their creativity. We're ensuring that innovation is recognized, protected, and rewarded in ways that create sustainable careers and drive continued technological progress. The second award went to Tom Baker, my former colleague at Techflow, who had provided crucial support during my own case and had subsequently become a leading advocate for intellectual property rights within the engineering community. Tom's presentation focused on the importance of peer support and workplace advocacy in protecting innovations. The most powerful protection for intellectual property isn't legal documentation or policy changes, Tom explained. It's having colleagues who understand the value of innovation and are willing to speak up when they see that value being suppressed or misappropriated. Cultural change happens one conversation, one relationship, and one act of advocacy at a time. The final award was presented to the University of Texas for its support of the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center and its commitment to democratizing access to intellectual property protection. Dr. Jennifer Walsh accepted the award on behalf of the university, emphasizing the academic institution's role in supporting systematic change. Universities have a responsibility to prepare students not just with technical skills, but with the knowledge and confidence to protect their intellectual contributions throughout their careers, Dr. Walsh said. The partnership with the Advocacy Center has allowed us to integrate intellectual property education into our engineering curriculum, ensuring that the next generation of technical professionals understands their rights from the beginning of their careers. As the award ceremony concluded, I was invited to the stage to provide closing remarks for the summit. Walking up to the podium, I looked out at the audience and saw faces that represented every stage of the journey I'd traveled over the past 4 years. There were engineers who were just beginning to understand their rights, attorneys who were developing expertise in intellectual property advocacy, executives who were implementing policy changes, and students who were preparing to enter the workforce with knowledge and confidence that previous generations had lacked. I began my remarks by acknowledging the remarkable progress that had been made since the center's founding. The statistics were impressive. Over 3,000 engineers had received legal assistance, patent filings by underrepresented groups had increased by 200%, and more than 50 companies had implemented comprehensive intellectual property protection programs. But the numbers, while important, didn't capture the full impact of what we'd accomplished together. The real measure of our success, I told the audience, isn't in the patents filed or the policies changed. It's in the confidence that technical professionals now feel about advocating for their innovations. It's in the cultural shift that has made intellectual property protection a standard expectation rather than an exceptional privilege. It's in the community we've built that supports and sustains advocacy efforts across the industry. I shared stories from engineers who had contacted the center over the past year, describing how education about intellectual property rights had transformed their careers and their relationship with their own capabilities. A software developer in Seattle who had negotiated a licensing agreement that provided ongoing royalties for her breakthrough algorithm. A hardware engineer in Boston who had successfully defended his patent against infringement by a major corporation. A startup founder in San Francisco who had built her company on technology she knew she legally owned and controlled. Each story represented not just individual success, but progress toward an industry culture that truly valued and protected innovation. The systematic changes we'd advocated for were becoming standard practice, creating an environment where technical professionals could focus on developing breakthrough technologies without fear of exploitation or appropriation. The work we're doing here extends far beyond intellectual property protection, I continued. We're building an industry that recognizes talent regardless of political dynamics, that rewards innovation based on merit rather than seniority, and that creates sustainable careers for the technical professionals whose creativity drives technological progress. As I concluded my remarks, I reflected on the personal journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years earlier, I'd been terminated from Techflow for supposedly creating substandard work. Today, I was directing a nationally recognized organization that was transforming how America's tech industry approached innovation and recognition. The algorithm that had been dismissed as inadequate was still generating substantial royalties and had been implemented by dozens of companies across multiple industries. But the professional vindication, while satisfying, was less meaningful than the knowledge that our work was making a difference in other people's lives. The young engineers, who would benefit from the resources and advocacy of the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center, represented the future of technological innovation. They deserved to work in an industry that valued their contributions, protected their intellectual property, and rewarded their innovations fairly. The summit concluded with a networking reception that continued late into the evening. Conversations buzzed with energy as attendees shared experiences, planned collaborations, and discussed strategies for advancing intellectual property protection in their respective organizations and communities. The connections being made would sustain and expand the advocacy efforts long after the summit ended. During the reception, I was approached by a young engineering student from Rice University who introduced herself as Jennifer Kim. She was part of a research team that had developed a breakthrough approach to quantum computing error correction, and she wanted advice about protecting their innovations while continuing their academic work. Ms. Martinez, your story has been incredibly inspiring for my generation of engineers, Jennifer said, her enthusiasm evident despite the late hour. We've grown up knowing that intellectual property protection is something we need to think about from the beginning of our careers, not something we figure out after innovations are stolen or suppressed. Her comment captured something profound about the cultural shift we'd helped create. The engineers entering the workforce today had fundamentally different expectations about recognition, protection, and advocacy than those of previous generations. They understood their rights, knew how to document their innovations, and felt confident about seeking legal protection for their intellectual property. The education and resources provided by the center have given us tools that weren't available to engineers just a few years ago, Jennifer continued. We're not just technically skilled, we're also legally informed and strategically prepared to protect our innovations throughout our careers. As the reception wound down and attendees began making their way back to hotels and flights, I found myself in the convention center's quiet lobby with Amanda Foster and Dr. Walsh, reflecting on the day's events and planning for the year ahead. The summit had exceeded our expectations in terms of attendance, engagement, and the quality of connections made among participants. Sarah, I think we need to start planning for international expansion, Amanda suggested, referring to inquiries we'd received from engineering organizations in Canada, the United Kingdom, and several European countries. The problems we're addressing aren't unique to the American tech industry, and the solutions we've developed could be adapted for different legal and cultural contexts. Dr. Walsh nodded in agreement, adding her perspective about the academic partnerships that could support international expansion. The university has connections with engineering schools around the world that could provide local expertise and institutional support for advocacy programs. The fundamental principles of protecting intellectual property and supporting innovation are universal, even if the specific implementation varies by country. The conversation continued as we walked toward the parking garage, discussing possibilities for expansion that I never could have imagined when we first opened the center's doors. The movement we'd helped create was growing beyond our original vision, developing momentum and reach that suggested genuine systematic change in how technical professionals understood and protected their intellectual contributions. 3 weeks after the summit, I received a phone call that brought the personal and professional dimensions of this journey full circle. The caller introduced himself as Marcus Rivera, CEO of a startup called Innovate Tech Solutions, and he explained that he was Michael Rivera's son. Michael had retired from Techflow the previous year, and Marcus had followed his father's career path into technology leadership. Ms. Martinez, I'm calling because our company has developed a breakthrough technology for renewable energy storage, and we want to ensure that our development process reflects the intellectual property protection principles my father learned during his time at Techflow, Marcus explained. We've reviewed the resources provided by the Advocacy Center, and we'd like to engage your consulting services to help us implement comprehensive IP protection policies from the beginning. The conversation was remarkable not just because of the family connection, but because it represented the generational impact of the cultural changes we'd helped create. Marcus had grown up hearing about the importance of intellectual property protection, and he was applying those principles to his own company's development. The lessons learned through my case with Techflow were being passed down and applied in new contexts. During our consulting engagement with Innovate Tech Solutions, I had the opportunity to work with their technical team to develop documentation systems, patent application processes, and recognition policies that protected individual innovations while supporting collaborative development. The engineers were young, talented, and remarkably sophisticated about intellectual property rights, reflecting the educational efforts that had been implemented throughout the engineering community. One of their lead developers, a brilliant young woman named Sarah Chen, had developed algorithms that could optimize battery performance by 30%. Unlike my experience years earlier, Sarah's contributions were immediately recognized, properly documented, and protected through patent applications that she controlled. Her work was valued and rewarded in ways that reflected its actual impact on the company's competitive position. The difference between our generation and previous ones, Sarah Chen told me during one of our meetings, is that we expect intellectual property protection to be part of the development process. We don't see it as an afterthought or a luxury, but as a fundamental aspect of professional engineering practice. Her perspective captured the systematic change we'd achieved through years of advocacy, education, and policy development. The engineers entering the workforce today had fundamentally different expectations about recognition and protection than those of previous generations. They understood their rights, knew how to document their innovations, and felt confident about seeking legal protection for their intellectual property. As winter approached, I found myself spending more time in the center's research division, which had been documenting patterns of intellectual property exploitation, and developing policy recommendations for addressing systematic problems. The data we'd collected over 3 years of operation painted a comprehensive picture of how exploitation occurred and what interventions were most effective in preventing it. Our research had identified several key factors that contributed to intellectual property exploitation: power imbalances between individual engineers and corporate management, lack of knowledge about legal protections, inadequate documentation of innovation processes, and cultural norms that discouraged advocacy and self-promotion. The most effective interventions addressed multiple factors simultaneously, combining legal education, policy changes, and community support. The research findings were being used to develop new educational programs, policy templates, and advocacy strategies that could be implemented across different industries and organizational contexts. Universities were incorporating intellectual property education into their engineering curricula, companies were adopting comprehensive protection policies, and professional organizations were providing resources and support for advocacy efforts. On the 4th anniversary of my termination from Techflow, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the company's annual Innovation Summit. The invitation came from the current CEO, Maria Santos, who had taken over leadership of the company after Michael Rivera's retirement. Maria's rise to CEO represented another dimension of the cultural transformation we'd helped create, with companies recognizing that protecting and promoting innovation required leadership that understood both technical development and intellectual property rights. Standing once again in Techflow Tower, this time as an invited speaker rather than a terminated employee, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought me to this moment. The conference room where I'd signed termination papers 4 years earlier had been converted into a space dedicated to showcasing employee innovations and patent achievements. The walls were lined with displays honoring engineers whose work had been protected and rewarded through the company's intellectual property programs. My presentation to Techflow's engineering team focused on the importance of advocacy and community support in protecting innovations. I shared stories from engineers across the industry who had successfully defended their intellectual property, negotiated fair licensing agreements, and built careers based on technology they knew they legally owned and controlled. The most important lesson from the past 4 years, I told the audience, is that intellectual property protection isn't just about legal documents or policy changes. It's about having the confidence to advocate for your own innovations and the community support to make that advocacy effective. It's about creating a culture where technical excellence is recognized, protected, and rewarded based on merit rather than political dynamics. After my presentation, I was approached by several young engineers who wanted to share their own experiences with intellectual property protection. Their stories were remarkably different from what I'd experienced years earlier. They described supportive managers, comprehensive documentation systems, and patent application processes that recognized and rewarded their innovations appropriately. One engineer, a recent graduate named David Park, had developed a breakthrough approach to data security that had been immediately recognized and protected through the company's IP programs. Ms. Martinez, I've heard the stories about what happened to you and others before the cultural changes, David said. It's hard to imagine working in an environment where innovations weren't protected and recognized. That seems like a different industry entirely. His comment captured the depth of the transformation that had occurred. The engineers entering the workforce today couldn't imagine the exploitation and suppression that had been standard practice just a few years earlier. The systematic changes we'd advocated for had become so embedded in industry culture that they were simply expected rather than exceptional. As I prepared to leave Techflow Tower that evening, I walked past the office that had been mine during my original employment. The space was now occupied by a young engineer whose desk was covered with patents, technical documentation, and awards, recognizing her contributions to the company's innovation programs. It was a visible reminder of how much had changed and how far the industry had progressed. The drive home through Austin's evening traffic gave me time to reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. What had begun as a personal fight for recognition had evolved into a movement that was transforming how America's tech industry approached innovation and intellectual property protection. The algorithm that had supposedly been substandard work was still generating royalties, still improving efficiency for companies around the world, and still serving as proof that innovation deserved recognition, regardless of political dynamics. But the professional vindication, while satisfying, was less meaningful than the knowledge that our work was making a difference in other people's lives. The young engineers who were benefiting from the resources and advocacy of the Intellectual Property Advocacy Center represented the future of technological innovation. They deserved to work in an industry that valued their contributions, protected their intellectual property, and rewarded their innovations fairly. That evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing plans for the center's expansion into international markets, I received an email that perfectly captured the impact of the work we'd been doing. The message was from Jennifer Kim, the Rice University student I'd met at the summit, who was writing to update me on her research team's success in protecting their quantum computing innovations. Ms. Martinez, I wanted to let you know that our patent applications have been approved, and we've successfully negotiated licensing agreements with 3 major technology companies, Jennifer wrote. The royalty income will support our continued research and provide financial security as we complete our doctoral programs. More importantly, we know that our innovations are protected and that we'll be properly credited for our contributions to quantum computing development. Her message continued with reflections on how intellectual property education had changed her expectations and career trajectory. The resources and advocacy provided by the center have given my generation of engineers something that wasn't available to previous generations: the knowledge and confidence to protect our innovations from the beginning of our careers. We're not just technically skilled, we're also legally informed and strategically prepared to build sustainable careers based on our intellectual contributions. Reading Jennifer's email, I realized that the most important chapters of this story were still being written. The Intellectual Property Advocacy Center was expanding its reach, developing new resources, and building partnerships that would extend intellectual property protection to even more technical professionals. The cultural transformation we'd helped create was becoming permanent, embedded in industry practices and professional expectations. The algorithm that had started this journey was still generating royalties, still improving data processing efficiency, and still serving as proof that innovation deserved recognition, regardless of the political dynamics that might try to suppress it. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when technical professionals understood their rights and felt empowered to advocate for their intellectual contributions. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about all the engineers who were working late in offices and home labs across the country, developing the technologies that would shape tomorrow. Unlike my experience years earlier, they were working in an industry that recognized their worth, protected their innovations, and rewarded their contributions fairly. The work of building that industry had been challenging and sometimes overwhelming, but it had been the most meaningful and impactful work of my career. The journey that had begun with a termination meeting and a forgotten patent application had evolved into something much larger and more significant than I ever could have imagined. The personal vindication was satisfying, but the systematic change was transformational. The future belonged to engineers, developers, and innovators who could create breakthrough technologies while also protecting their right to be recognized and rewarded for their work. 5 years later, I stood in the gleaming atrium of the newly constructed Innovators' Rights Institute headquarters in downtown Austin, watching as the final preparations were made for the dedication ceremony. The building itself was a testament to how far we'd come from those early days of meeting in coffee shops and university conference rooms. 6 stories of modern architecture housed legal clinics, research laboratories, educational facilities, and collaboration spaces that served as the epicenter of a global movement to protect intellectual property rights for technical professionals. The dedication ceremony would officially launch our international expansion program, with satellite offices already operating in London, Tokyo, Berlin, and Toronto. Each location had been adapted to local legal frameworks and cultural contexts, but all shared the same fundamental mission of ensuring that innovation was recognized, protected, and rewarded, regardless of political dynamics or power imbalances. As I reviewed my remarks for the ceremony, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this moment. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect my own intellectual property had evolved into an institution that was reshaping how the global technology industry approached innovation and recognition. The statistics were remarkable. Over 15,000 engineers had received legal assistance, Patent filings by underrepresented groups had increased by 400% globally, and more than 200 companies had implemented comprehensive intellectual property protection programs based on our policy templates. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the most significant achievement. We had fundamentally altered the expectations and experiences of technical professionals entering the workforce. Today's engineering graduates understood their rights, knew how to document their innovations, and felt confident about advocating for proper recognition and protection. The exploitation and suppression that had been routine just years earlier was now recognized as unacceptable and unsustainable. The ceremony began with presentations from engineers whose careers had been transformed through the Institute's programs. Marcus Chen, who had developed revolutionary advances in renewable energy storage, described how proper intellectual property protection had enabled him to build a company that was now valued at over $2 billion. Dr. Aisha Patel shared her experience successfully defending her biotechnology patents against infringement by major pharmaceutical corporations, establishing precedents that protected smaller innovators from corporate appropriation. Each speaker represented not just individual success, but progress toward an industry culture that truly valued and protected innovation. The systematic changes we'd advocated for had become standard practice, creating an environment where technical professionals could focus on developing breakthrough technologies without fear of exploitation or appropriation. Amanda Foster, now serving as the Institute's general counsel, delivered the keynote address about the legal transformation that had occurred across multiple industries. Her presentation highlighted landmark cases that had established stronger protections for employee innovations, court decisions that had clarified intellectual property rights, and policy changes that had democratized access to patent protection. The work we've accomplished here represents more than legal victories or policy reforms, Amanda told the audience of nearly 1,000 attendees. We've changed the fundamental relationship between innovation and recognition, ensuring that creativity is rewarded based on merit rather than political positioning or institutional bias. As the ceremony concluded and I prepared to deliver closing remarks, I thought about the personal transformation that had paralleled the institutional changes. The woman who had signed termination papers in a glass conference room 5 years earlier, convinced of her own inadequacy, had evolved into someone who could stand before global leaders in technology and law, confident in the value of her contributions and the importance of her mission. My final remarks focus not on past achievements but on future possibilities. The Institute was launching new programs to support student innovators, expand intellectual property education in developing countries, and develop emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Each initiative represented an opportunity to ensure that the next generation of breakthrough innovations would be properly recognized and protected from the beginning. The algorithm that started this journey continues to generate value and recognition, I told the audience. But its greatest legacy isn't the technical innovation itself, but the systematic changes it helped create to protect and promote innovation for countless others. The future belongs to those who can create breakthrough technologies, while also protecting their right to be recognized and rewarded for their contributions. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the Institute's Innovation Gallery showcasing protected inventions from around the world, I received a message that brought the personal dimension of this journey to a profound conclusion. The text was from Emma Martinez, my daughter, who had just completed her first year of engineering school at MIT. Mom, I wanted you to know that my professors use your case as a primary example in our intellectual property course. They explain how proper documentation and strategic advocacy can protect innovations and transform careers. I'm incredibly proud to be your daughter, and to be entering a profession where the changes you fought for are now standard expectations. Emma's message captured something profound about the generational impact of the work we'd accomplished. She was entering an engineering profession that her mother's generation had helped transform, where intellectual property protection was integrated into professional education rather than learned through painful experience, where advocacy and recognition were expected rather than exceptional. Standing in that gleaming atrium as the celebration continued around me, I realized that the most important victory wasn't personal vindication or professional success, but the knowledge that Emma and her generation would never have to endure the exploitation and suppression that had nearly destroyed my career. They would work in an industry that valued their contributions, protected their innovations, and rewarded their creativity from the very beginning of their professional lives. The journey that had begun with a termination meeting and a forgotten patent application had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined. The algorithm that had supposedly been substandard work was still generating royalties and improving efficiency for companies around the world, but its greatest value was as a symbol of what became possible when technical professionals understood their rights and felt empowered to advocate for recognition. As the evening concluded and the Institute's headquarters gradually emptied, I walked through the building one final time, visiting each floor and remembering the countless conversations, meetings, and collaborations that had made this moment possible. The legal clinics where thousands of engineers had received protection for their innovations. The research laboratories where policy recommendations were developed and tested. The educational facilities where the next generation of technical professionals learned about their rights and responsibilities. This was more than a building or an organization. It was a testament to the power of refusing to accept narratives that diminish your worth, to the importance of standing up for principles even when the personal cost seems overwhelming, and to the possibility of transforming individual struggles into systematic change that benefits countless others. The future stretched ahead with unlimited possibilities for continued innovation, protection, and recognition. The work would continue, the community would grow, and the culture would evolve to better serve the technical professionals whose creativity and expertise drive technological progress. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, I felt complete confidence that the foundation was solid, the momentum was sustainable, and the mission would endure long beyond any individual contributor. Walking out into the Austin evening, I thought about tomorrow's challenges and opportunities, about the engineers working late in laboratories around the world, about the innovations being developed that would shape the next decade of technological progress. They would work in an industry that recognized their worth, protected their intellectual property, and rewarded their contributions fairly. That knowledge, more than any personal achievement or professional recognition, represented the true measure of what we had accomplished together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.